Hi everybody, and welcome to another video in my Piano to Orchestra series. Instead of one long video, I thought it might be useful to split this up into several shorter ones, which will allow me to focus a bit more in depth about all of the orchestration decisions that I make, as well as constructing the initial piano score. In the last video I posted, I used the following chord progression to demonstrate chord voicings and inversions. The key I used was B minor, and I'm just using the tonic B minor chord, the major 6 chord, the minor 4, and the dominant F sharp major chord in the progression. In that video, I demonstrated several different voicings like this one, and even added some extended notes to make the harmonies richer. Today, I'll build on that and start the process of making a longer composition. This specific video will focus on my pre-compositional process, including narrowing in on the harmonic content, as well as constructing an overall formal outline for a 3 to 4 minute piece. Though I'll be restricting myself to only these chords through the entire duration of the piece, I'll want to find additional notes to use beyond the notes that make up each triad. Otherwise, the piece could get a little boring very quickly. So today I'll look at how I determine pitch collections for each chord using scales. There's a lot of music in many genres, including film music or popular music, and even classical music, especially in the minimalist style, that is entirely built upon a set of chords that repeats over and over. One of the more famous recent examples is Hans Zimmer's Time from the movie Inception. He uses this progression of 8 chords over and over and over again. The entire piece is built from this progression, and so instead of changing the harmonic content, Zimmer focuses on how some of the other aspects of composition change over time, including pulse, density, timbre, and register, just to name a few. In fact, keeping the harmony the same throughout can be an effective mechanism for constructing musical form. It sort of locks you into a structure, which then forces you to consider all of these other musical components effectively. So I'll attempt something similar with this progression. It won't sound anything like the Zimmer piece. I don't have the sound design skills to make that happen. So instead, I'll focus on more traditional orchestration. But that doesn't mean that I won't be thinking a lot about the same types of musical devices as Zimmer was. I'll just be implementing them in different ways. Like I said, in this first short video, I want to discuss my process for determining which notes to use throughout the piece. For any of these chords, I can obviously use the 3 notes of the triad, but I can also use other scale degrees in either the chord themselves or in melodic material. So I'll construct a scale for each of these chords. The scale may or may not be the same for each chord, so it's best to figure out each one separately. For the B minor chord, I can simply use a B minor scale. I'm using a natural minor scale with a flat 7, but depending on the piece of music that you're writing, you should determine which type of scale to use. For instance, you might find that the raised 6th or 7th scale degree would work well in your piece. Looking at these scale degrees, these are the notes that make up the basic triad, and so the rest of the notes are potential extended tones. Oftentimes for me, I'll test each of these out in order that they appear, starting with this 2nd scale degree. I'll try out a few different voicings using that 2nd scale degree. Here are just a few. I think the first 3 voicings fit with what I'm looking for, but not the last voicing. So that tells me that the 2nd scale degree in this B minor chord will work better in a cluster or voicing a minor 2nd below the minor 3rd. When it's more exposed and isolated, like in that 4th voicing, it presents a different color, one that doesn't really fit with what I'm trying to write today. This just goes to show how complex chord voicing really is and how dependent on the context it is. The inner relationships between individual notes within a chord really matters and has an effect on the sound. So normally I'd go through each extended chord tone and determine which ones might be useful options at some point in the compositional process. I'd look at the G major chord and determine that the scale that fits the chord, it's actually the same set of pitches as the B minor scale. However, now these additional extended tones have a different relation to G. I've experimented with a few different chord voicings, and I think I'll be able to use any of these additional notes. In the first voicing, I use the major 7th and 2nd scale degree. In the next chord, I use the 2nd and 6th scale degree. In the last voicing, I use the 2nd, the 4th, and 6th scale degree. Each of these chords sounds a bit different, but to me, they could all potentially work at some point in the piece. At the very least, these additional notes can be used as passing tones in some sort of melodic material. I'll skip the E minor chord, I'll use the same collection of pitches for that one, but this F sharp major chord is a bit different. The scale that I've chosen to use over the F sharp major chord contains both the lowered and raised 7th scale degree. However, I won't use both of them simultaneously. There are times when I want the leading tone of the chord, other times when I want the dominant 7. Here's what I mean by that. As I was working out some of these scales and chords, I really liked using the E sharp or the raised 7th scale degree of the F sharp chord in the upper voice of a chord, almost like a melody note. I played this passage here and really liked the voice leading between chords. The dominant 7th or E natural appears in this first beat, then in beat 2, the top voice moves to an E sharp. Notice that in the lower voice, I move away from that E sharp in beat 2. I don't want those two pitches, the E sharp and the E natural, to be present simultaneously. That would create too harsh of a dissonance. I obviously like a little bit of dissonance, but there are degrees of dissonance and you have to determine where the line is. It's just really dependent on the piece of music you're writing. So then in beat 4, I move the leading tone, that E sharp, up to the F sharp, and the E natural appears once again in a lower voice. You might consider this second chord to be a passing chord, in other words, not an F sharp chord, but a passing chord that moves from and to an F sharp chord. That's fine, there are a bunch of ways to analyze this. The point is I'll be using both 7th scale degrees during those F sharp chord measures, just not simultaneously. So once I've determined the scales and pitch collections for each chord, I can take a step back and look at the entire progression as a whole. So for the B minor, G major, and E minor chords, this pitch collection on the left will work. And when I move to the F sharp chord, the pitch collection on the right will work. To give you a sense of what this collection sounds like over these roots, I'll just play the appropriate scale in eighth notes in the right hand over top bass notes in the left hand. I'm going to switch gears here and finish up this video by talking about creating an outline for the form of the piece. In the next video that I upload, I'll start composing the piano score, and at all times, I'll keep in mind the following musical parameters: harmony, melody, pulse, motion, meter, tempo, register, density, dynamics, and articulation. I've spent most of this video discussing harmony, and in addition to the pitch collections that I'll use, I'll also want to think about the harmonic form of the piece. In other words, how does the harmonic content change or evolve throughout the piece? Even though the chords are repeating in a loop, I've already demonstrated how adding additional chord tones can change the sound quite a bit. So you can shape the form of the piece by choosing when to add those additional notes and when to remove them. For instance, I might choose to have only 2 notes of the chord present at one point in the piece, and then later on I might have up to 5 notes per chord for a much richer, denser harmony. There are always many parameters of music operating simultaneously, and you should always be thinking about how these parameters evolve independently and in relation to each other. For instance, not only does the harmonic content change between these two examples, but the overall density is much different, with the top example having a very open or sparse texture, and the bottom example much more dense. The register has also changed, with the top example confined to mostly the treble clef staff register, and the bottom example is expanded in the lower register. So a lot of these parameters are very much related, but it doesn't mean that I always have to have, for instance, the register and density change in the exact same way. In this example, the density remains low, but the register has changed dramatically. There's quite a gap now between the low and high voices, which will result in a more hollow texture. I also want to briefly discuss the difference between these four parameters. There's a bit of overlap here, but each one can be considered independently from the others. Pulse and motion are a bit different in my opinion. I can have a component within the texture provide a steady pulse, but that doesn't necessarily mean the texture has a lot of motion in it. In this example, the left-hand material provides a steady quarter note pulse, but I'd hardly say there's a lot of motion in this texture. On the other hand, in this example, there's a greater sense of textural motion, but not as clear of a pulse. Meter, tempo, and pulse can have an interesting relationship as well. Let's take this example again, the one with the quarter note pulse in a 3/4 meter. I could just as easily write this in 6/8, and if the value of the eighth note is the same as the original quarter note, these two ways of notating the music will sound almost identical. Or I could use meter and tempo changes to really create an interesting musical transition. In this example, the tempo starts at quarter note equals 60 beats per minute. In the first two measures, the rhythms establish a pulse of eighth notes and quarter notes, so the meter of 4/4 is pretty clearly heard. Then in measure 3, the right hand material switches to a quarter note triplet rhythm, so it almost starts a contrasting pulse at this point, one that works against the 4/4 meter. Here's what these four measures sound like. So I could decide that in the very next measure, I want to firmly establish the quarter note triplet pulse as the dominant pulse in the texture. I could, of course, continue writing quarter note triplet rhythms, or instead, I could change the tempo to convert what was a quarter note triplet to now a regular quarter note. This would be an example of a metric modulation. The duration of one of these quarter note triplets is now equal to one of these regular quarter notes in the new tempo. And all I did was multiply the original tempo by 3/2, so 60 BPM becomes 90 BPM. There are all kinds of metric modulations. This is just one pretty standard example of how it could be implemented. So here's what these full 6 measures sound like. Creating an outline serves one main function in the compositional process. I force myself to think about the entire shape of the piece before I start inputting notes in Dorco or whatever method I'm using for writing down the music. I'll admit I don't always make an outline, and sometimes I want to rely more on intuition or to respond in the moment to what I just wrote. However, I find that the music that I'm most proud of usually started out as an outline of some kind or another. The trick is to envision the overall flow and structure of the piece without getting boxed in. I still like having the ability to let the composition process unfold in unexpected ways. There are several ways to make an outline, and you might find that certain methods work better in certain situations. I could decide that the overall shape is to be based on 6 complete repetitions of my chord progression. So for the sake of the outline, I'll assign each iteration of the progression a letter name, A through F. Then I'll use most of those same parameters from before and force myself to consider them during each section of the piece. By the way, I'm not even discussing orchestration here, so you could include things like timbre as well. It's never too early in the process to think about orchestration, but I'll save that for another video. Starting at the beginning, I've decided I want to begin in 4/4 with a slow tempo. I'll start out with just two instruments playing contrapuntally in the upper register. I'll purposefully make the harmonic progression a bit ambiguous for now. No need to overdo that early on. The texture will be very thin, delicate, and soft, with mostly long, sustaining notes without too much of a sense of pulse. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how I came up with that just now. At this point in the process, it can be mostly intuitive, but making decisions about one section can then force you to consider how those parameters change over time. The next section will switch to a 3/4 meter using a metric modulation. I'm not exactly sure how this will play out yet, but I think it might be interesting. Other than that, the texture sort of continues where the first section left off, with the register extending downward and a slight sense that the texture is building. Moving on, the harmony in the next section will be more clearly outlined with simple triads. There will be a stronger sense of pulse, and the texture will continue to grow overall. The section after that, I'll finally introduce some more clear motivic material, and I'll start to add more extended notes in the harmony. The texture will build to a climactic fortissimo with a much fuller register overall and a strong sense of pulse. Immediately after that, I'll have another tempo change, yet another metric modulation. The overall density and dynamics will come down, and I'll try to create a strong eighth note pulse in the middle ground with an almost pointillistic quality. And finally, in the last section, the motion and pulse will kind of die down, and the harmonies will simplify to mostly just triads. I want a dark and heavy texture in the low register, creating a really dramatic ending, maybe even fading to nothing. So that's my outline for the piece. Like I said, I'm providing myself enough information to get started actually composing, yet I'll allow myself to change things as I go, especially if inspiration takes me in a different direction while I'm working. In the next video, I'll compose the short score to this, using this outline as a guide. In the videos after that, I'll orchestrate the piece from the short score. And who knows, maybe I'll make a video on mocking it up using sample libraries. Also, I want to invite all of my patrons who are interested to work on a similar type of piece, one that's based on a repeating chord progression. If any of my patrons come up with a chord progression that you like, send it to me and I'll share my thoughts. I'd also love to see an outline for a piece based on your progression. The outline doesn't have to look like this. It could be much simpler or even more complex than this. Doesn't really matter. I'll send out a request on Patreon, but I wanted to mention it here on my channel as well in case anyone's been thinking about joining me over on Patreon. So thanks so much for watching and stay tuned for the next one. See you then.